All right, so today we're going to be diving into a paper that's got me thinking about, like, the core of how we understand the world. You know, the stuff that makes us, us.
Oh yeah, this one's a deep cut. I really enjoyed digging into this.
It's all about how we can build AI that thinks a bit more like we do, especially when it comes to navigating the world, both physically and in, like, the realm of ideas.
And it all starts with these things called grid cells.
Grid cells, exactly.
Fascinating stuff.
This paper, a grid cell-inspired structured vector algebra for cognitive maps, is proposing a whole new way to represent information, a way that draws directly from how these grid cells work in our brains. The goal is to give AI a sort of internal compass, but one that's way more powerful than just pointing north. A compass that works for everything from finding your way home to understanding complex concepts.
Yeah, it's like giving AI that aha moment, where things just click into place.
Yeah, so before we get too deep into the technical weeds, let's set the stage a bit. For those who might not be familiar with grid cells, what are we even talking about here?
Okay, so imagine you're walking around a room.
Okay, got it, I'm strolling.
As you move, certain cells in your brain, these grid cells, fire in a really specific pattern, forming a kind of invisible hexagonal grid over the space. It's like your brain is laying down a coordinate system for the environment.
So it's not just about knowing where you are at any given moment, but having this sort of underlying map that helps you understand the relationships between different locations.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that recent research suggests that grid cells might not be limited to just physical spaces.
Oh, really?
There are hints that our brains might use a similar kind of grid-like coding to organize abstract concepts as well.
So, like, the relationships between different ideas.
Yeah, think about how you might visualize your family tree or the connections between different concepts in, say, physics. There's a growing idea that the brain might be using a common system for navigating both the concrete and the abstract, which is a pretty mind-blowing concept when you think about it.
Yeah, that's huge. And this paper is trying to capture that idea computationally, which is no small feat. So they're drawing inspiration from these grid cells, but how have scientists been trying to model them so far?
So there are two main approaches that have been pretty successful. The first one is called Continuous Attractor Networks, or CANs for short.
Okay, CANs.
Think of a network of neurons, all interconnected, and as input comes in, the overall activity of this network settles into a stable pattern, like a bump or a blob that shifts around as the input changes. In the case of grid cells, this bump of activity moves smoothly across the network as an animal moves through space, and because of the way the neurons are connected, you get that hexagonal firing pattern. It's often visualized as a network on the surface of a torus, like a donut shape.
So it's like the activity of the network is representing your location within that space.
Exactly. Now, the other approach is called oscillatory interference models.
All right, oscillatory interference.
This one's a bit more wave-like. The idea is that grid cell firing is the result of different brainwave patterns interfering with each other. Imagine several oscillators, each tuned to different aspects of movement, like speed and direction. When their peaks align in just the right way, a grid cell fires.
Ah, so it's like a symphony of brainwaves creating this spatial code.
Exactly. Both CANs and oscillatory interference models have their strengths and weaknesses, and they've both been pretty good at explaining how grid cells work in physical spaces.
But the big challenge, as this paper points out, is how to extend these models to account for our ability to reason about abstract concepts using the same kind of framework. That's where Vector Symbolic Architectures, or VSAs, come in.
VSAs are like a whole other way of thinking about how information is represented and processed in the brain, and potentially in AI as well.
Okay, so VSAs, what's the basic idea there?
At their core, VSAs use high-dimensional vectors to represent information. You can think of a vector as just a long list of numbers.
Okay, like coordinates in a really high-dimensional space.
Yeah. Exactly. And in a VSA, each concept, each word, even each object gets its own unique vector.
So apple might have one vector and banana would have a different one.
Precisely. Now, the really cool part is that you can perform operations on these vectors to represent relationships and combinations.
Like mathematical operations.
Yes, but they're a bit different from what you might be used to. There are two main ones: bundling and binding. Bundling is like adding vectors together to create a representation of a set of things.
So if you bundle the vectors for apple, banana, and orange, you get a vector that represents fruit.
That's the idea. Now, binding is a bit more complex. It's a way of combining vectors in a way that captures relationships or features. So you might bind the vector for red with a vector for apple to represent a red apple.
And what's really cool about binding is that it's reversible.
Exactly. You can perform an unbinding operation to pull those combined representations apart and retrieve the original components. So if you unbind red from the red apple vector, you're left with the vector for apple.
So it's like a way of encoding complex relationships and then being able to query those relationships to get specific information.
Exactly. And this paper focuses on a particular type of VSA called Fourier Holographic Reduced Representations, or FHRR.
FHRR, all right. What makes FHRR special?
FHRR uses complex numbers for its vectors.
Okay, complex numbers, those are the ones with like an imaginary component.
That's right. You can think of a complex number as having both a magnitude, like a length, and a direction, like an angle. And in FHRR, the binding operation is basically element-wise multiplication of these complex numbers.
So it means?
Which means that you're essentially adding their angles or phases together. This turns out to be really useful for representing things that vary continuously, like spatial positions.
So it's like the phase of the complex number is encoding a location along a particular dimension.
Exactly. And they use something called fractional power encoding, or FPE, where you can repeatedly bind a vector with itself to move along that dimension. And fractional binding allows for smooth transitions between locations.
So you can represent movement through space using these complex number operations. That's pretty neat.
Yeah, it's quite elegant.
Now, this is where it starts to get really interesting. They take this idea of FHRR and try to make it more biologically grounded with their Grid Cell VSA, or GCVSA. Instead of just using those complex numbers, they introduce these 3D neuronal modules. What are these modules, and how do they fit into the picture?
So imagine taking each element of an FHRR vector, which is a complex number, and replacing it with a small 3D grid of simulated neurons, like a 3x3x3 cube.
Okay, so each element becomes a little cube of neurons.
Exactly. Each of these modules then becomes a mini representation of a 2D point in space.
So like a tiny grid cell within the overall VSA vector.
That's a good way to think about it. Now, the encoding of a 2D point within a module happens in a few steps. First, you rotate the 2D coordinates based on a specific orientation assigned to that module.
So each module has its own preferred direction.
Yeah, just like grid cells in the brain seem to be organized into modules with different orientations.
Yeah.
Then, these rotated coordinates are projected into a 3D hexagonal coordinate system.
Hexagonal, to mimic the grid cell firing patterns.
Precisely. And finally, these 3D coordinates determine the activation of each of the 27 neurons within the module using these phase-shifted cosine functions. It's a bit mathy, but the key takeaway is that unlike FHRR, where each element has a single phase, each GCVSA module has a 3D spatial phase and a magnitude of activation spread across its neurons.
So it's like each module is encoding both the location and the strength of that location within its little 3D space.
That's a good way to put it.
And the overall GCVSA representation isn't just one of these modules, right? It's a whole collection of them.
Exactly. You have a bunch of these modules, each with its own orientation and scale.
Scale.
Yeah, they vary in size, again, mimicking how grid cells in the brain seem to come in different scales. The entire GCVSA vector is like a 5D structure.
5D.
3 dimensions for the spatial arrangement within each module, 1 for the module's orientation, and 1 for its scale. This structured organization is really what allows them to do some pretty amazing things.
All right, so we've got these GCVSA vectors, these 5D structures with all these modules. How do you actually combine and manipulate them? Do they still use bundling and binding like in regular VSAs?
They do, but with some clever adaptations for these 3D modules, bundling remains pretty straightforward. It's just element-wise addition of the neural activity across all the corresponding modules.
So if you bundle 2 GCVSA vectors, you're essentially adding the activity of each corresponding module.
Exactly. Binding, however, is a bit more involved. Instead of element-wise multiplication, it becomes module-wise circular convolution.
Circular convolution. Okay, that sounds complicated.
It is, but think of it like taking the 3D activation patterns within a module and sliding one over the other in a circular way.
Yeah.
Mathematically, it's equivalent to multiplying their representations in the frequency domain, similar to how FHRR works, but now it's happening locally within each module.
Oh, so it's like you're matching up the spatial patterns within each module.
Exactly. And just like with FHRR, they can perform fractional circular convolution to represent real valued positions.
Okay, so that covers bundling and binding. But the paper mentions a third operation that's unique to GCVSA rotation.
Yeah, this is where the structured organization of the modules really shines. Because you have all these modules arranged by orientation and scale, you can perform a kind of rotation operation by essentially permuting the activity between modules along a ring of constant scale.
So you're shifting the activity around a ring of modules that all have the same size.
Precisely. And they even have a way to perform circular convolution along these rings using a rotation vector to achieve a rotation by a specific angle.
So you can rotate the entire spatial representation within the GCVSA vector. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's a really clever extension of VSA operations into the spatial domain. It does have some limitations, especially for things located far from the center of the represented space, but it opens up a lot of possibilities.
All right, so we've encoded information into these GCVSA vectors. We've bundled them, bound them, rotated them. How do you actually get information back out? How do you know what a particular GCVSA vector represents?
That's where codebooks and cosine similarity come in. A codebook is basically a predefined set of GCVSA vectors, each representing a known entity or a specific value.
So like a dictionary of GCVSA representations.
Exactly. To figure out what a particular GCVSA vector represents, you compare it to every vector in the codebook using cosine similarity.
Cosine similarity, that's a way of measuring how similar two vectors are, right?
Right. It gives you a value between -1 and 1, where 1 means they're perfectly aligned and -1 means they're completely opposite.
So you find the codebook vector that's most similar to your target vector, and that tells you what it represents.
Exactly.
All right, so they put this GCVSA model through its paces with a series of tests. The first one was path integration, basically simulating movement through space. How did it do?
Impressively well. They started by encoding a 2D starting position and then simulated movement by repeatedly binding the GCVSA vector with the velocity information. At each step, they decoded the resulting vector using a codebook of positions, and they were able to reconstruct the entire path with very little error.
So GCVSA can accurately track movement over time.
Exactly.
The next test was representing spatiotemporal scenes, which sounds way more complicated.
It is. Here they had to encode objects that had both spatial and temporal information, like their location and when they were there, as well as their identity.
So like a scene with multiple objects moving around over time.
Yeah, like that. They bound all this information together for each object and then bundled the objects together into a single scene vector. The challenge was to ask questions about this scene, like, where was the apple at 3 p.m.?
And could they do it?
They could. They used a resonator network, which is basically a way to iteratively refine the representation, and they were able to successfully retrieve information about objects even when they only had partial information available.
So GCVSA can handle these complex multi-object scenes with both spatial and temporal information.
Exactly. It highlights the model's ability to integrate different kinds of information within a single framework.
Now, the final test, and maybe the most intriguing one, was spatial symbolic computation, specifically analogical reasoning on family trees. How did GCVSA fare there?
This is where things get really interesting. They represented family trees as these hierarchical structures within GCVSA vectors. They used the binding operation to encode parent-child relationships.
So binding father with son to represent that relationship.
Exactly, and they used that rotation-like permutation operation we talked about earlier to represent the different levels in the tree, like grandparents, parents, and children.
Ah, so the rotation is like moving up or down the hierarchy.
Exactly. By creating two analogous family trees with different names, they were able to derive a kind of translation vector between the two trees. Applying this vector to a person in one family tree allowed them to identify the corresponding person in the other tree.
So they could answer questions like, who is the John in your family?
Precisely. It's a really elegant demonstration of abstract analogical reasoning using this spatial framework.
It's mind-blowing that you can represent these abstract relationships using a system inspired by how we navigate physical spaces.
It really highlights the potential for this kind of approach to bridge the gap between different domains of cognition.
Now, the paper also talks about how GCVSA might be particularly well suited for neuromorphic computing, which is basically building computer chips that mimic the structure of the brain. Why is there a connection there?
There are several reasons. VSAs in general, and GCVSA in particular, have a few properties that make them really attractive for neuromorphic hardware. First, they're very robust to noise, which is important because real-world neural systems are inherently noisy. Second, they can be implemented in a highly parallel way, which aligns perfectly with the way neuromorphic chips are designed.
So instead of having one central processor doing everything sequentially, You can have many processing units working on different parts of the problem simultaneously, like in the brain.
Exactly. And GCVSA's modular structure with those 3D modules makes it even more suitable for parallel implementation. The binding and bundling operations happen locally within each module, so you can have different units working on different modules at the same time.
Ah, so it's like each module is a little processing unit.
That's a good way to think about it. And the 3D block code they use with those phase-shifted cosine functions has another advantage. It offers a good balance between distributed and localized representations, which is potentially very efficient in terms of communication. You might even be able to get away with just a few spikes per module to transmit information.
Spikes, like the electrical pulses that neurons use to communicate.
Yeah, like that. And sparsity of communication is crucial for energy efficiency, especially in neuromorphic systems that aim to mimic the brain's incredibly low power consumption.
So GCVSA seems to tick a lot of the boxes for neuromorphic computing. That's pretty exciting.
It is. It suggests that this kind of biologically inspired approach might not just be good for understanding the brain, but also for building more efficient and robust AI.
The researchers also discuss how GCVSA relates to other VSA models out there, like FHRR, which we talked about earlier, and sparse block codes. What are the main differences and advantages of GCVSA?
Well, you can think of GCVSA as building upon FHRR. Instead of just using complex numbers, it adds more internal structure by representing those complex numbers as spatial patterns within those 3D modules.
So it's like FHRR on steroids.
In a way, yeah. Now, compared to sparse block codes, which rely on binary activations, GCVSA uses continuous activations with those cosine functions, which makes it better suited for representing continuous values and performing those fractional binding operations we talked about.
So it's more flexible and can handle more nuanced representations.
Exactly. And compared to some earlier VSA models like holographic reduced representations, where binding involves this global circular convolution across the entire vector, GCVSA's module-wise binding is much more efficient computationally.
Ah, so it's faster and potentially less resource intensive.
And of course, the introduction of that rotation operation gives GCVSA a unique capability for spatial computation that most other VSAs don't have.
So it's more specialized for spatial reasoning, but it can also handle abstract concepts.
Exactly. It's a really nice balance.
Now, what about the biological plausibility? How well does GCVSA actually match up with what we know about how grid cells work in the brain?
This is one of the areas where I think GCVSA really shines. Unlike some earlier VSA models that might only exhibit hexagonal patterns in the overall similarity between representations, GCVSA actually produces those hexagonal-like receptive fields at the level of individual neurons within its modules.
So each simulated neuron within a module has a preferred location in space, just like real grid cells.
Exactly. This is much more in line with those continuous attractor network models, where the movement of activity bumps across the network leads to those hexagonal firing patterns.
So it's like GCVSA is merging the best of both worlds, the representational power of VSAs and the biological plausibility of CANs.
That's a great way to put it. And the paper even proposes that a CAN model using circular convolution for binding might actually exhibit those algebraic properties that are so powerful in VSAs.
So it's like coming full circle.
Yeah, it's really neat. Now, this particular work focuses on the encoding side of things, how information is represented in GCVSA, but they also point out that the dynamics of attractor networks could potentially be implemented using biologically plausible learning rules like Hebbian learning.
Hebbian learning, that's the neurons that fire together, wire together rule, right?
That's the one. So it's like they're laying the groundwork for a more complete model that includes both encoding and learning.
That's really exciting. It sounds like GCVSA is a really promising direction for understanding how our brains might represent and manipulate information, and potentially for building more brain-like AI.
Absolutely.
What kind of future research do the authors suggest based on this work?
Well, they point to a few really interesting avenues. One key area is incorporating learning mechanisms, both from machine learning and from neuroscience, to allow these systems to learn spatial and abstract maps dynamically.
So not just having predefined representations, but actually learning them from experience.
Exactly. They also suggest exploring reinforcement learning and self-supervised learning techniques, which are becoming increasingly powerful in AI.
They mentioned a connection between their fractional power encoding method and the rotary positional encoding used in transformer networks. Those are the things that are powering a lot of the recent advances in natural language processing.
Yeah, transformers are all the rage these days. It's intriguing that there might be a link between these seemingly disparate areas.
So they're suggesting that GCVSA might offer insights into how to improve how transformers handle spatial information.
Exactly. It's like cross-pollination between different fields of AI research.
This is really fascinating stuff. It makes you think about the fundamental principles that might underlie intelligence itself, both in our brains and in the artificial systems we're trying to build.
I totally agree. It's one of those papers that really expands your thinking about what's possible.
Absolutely. Now, for those of you who are eager to dive into the nitty-gritty details of this work, the link to the paper is in the show notes. And for those who want to stick around, we're going to move into our Novel Notions segment, where we take the ideas from the paper and speculate a bit about where they might lead.
This is where we get to have some fun.
Exactly. So let's riff a bit on this idea of a unified framework for spatial and abstract reasoning. What if we could use GCVSA as a foundation for building AI agents that have a more intuitive understanding of analogies?
Ooh, that's a good one.
The paper shows how GCVSA can handle analogical reasoning with family trees. But what if we could extend that to more complex, real-world scenarios?
Like, imagine an AI that could understand the analogy between the flow of electricity in a circuit and the flow of water in pipes.
Not just at a surface level, but in a way that allows it to transfer knowledge and problem-solving strategies between these seemingly different domains.
Yeah, that would be huge.
And the fact that GCVSA can handle both spatial structures and hierarchical relationships suggests that it might have the representational power to capture the underlying similarities in those kinds of analogies.
And if we could develop learning mechanisms for GCVSA, maybe an AI could learn to identify those analogies on its own.
That would be incredible. It would be like a form of AI creativity.
And thinking about neuromorphic computing, the structured modular nature of GCVSA might make it perfect for implementing these kinds of analogical reasoning processes in low-power hardware.
You could have robots that can learn new tasks much more quickly by drawing on their understanding of analogous situations, just like humans do.
That's the dream.
Now, here's another thought. The paper demonstrates GCVSA's ability to perform path integration and represent locations. Could we use this framework for more sophisticated forms of spatial planning and decision-making?
Ooh, that's interesting.
Instead of just knowing where you are, could a GCVSA-based system reason about the optimal path to a goal, taking into account obstacles and maybe even abstract preferences or constraints?
I think that's definitely worth exploring. The algebraic properties of VSAs, combined with that structured spatial representation of GCVSA, might allow for some really efficient and flexible planning algorithms.
The binding and unbinding operations could be used to explore different possible paths and evaluate their outcomes within the same representational space.
Yeah, you could have AI agents that can navigate and strategize in complex environments with a level of sophistication that we haven't seen before.
It's exciting to think about all the possibilities. This research really feels like it's opening up a whole new way of thinking about how we can build intelligence.
I completely agree. It's inspiring stuff.
Just a reminder that these novel notions are just our speculative ideas for future research based on the fantastic work presented in this paper.
It's always fun to speculate a bit.
All right, so to wrap up our deep dive into a grid cell-inspired structured vector algebra for cognitive maps, we've seen how this paper proposes a really novel, biologically inspired approach to unify spatial and symbolic computation in machine learning. By drawing inspiration from the brain's grid cells and leveraging the power of VSAs, the GCVSA model offers a really promising framework with potential implications for AI, robotics, and neuromorphic computing.
It's a great example of how studying the brain can lead to new insights and innovations in artificial intelligence.
Absolutely, and it makes you wonder about the fundamental ways in which intelligence might arise, both in our own minds and in the artificial systems we're striving to create.
It's a question that keeps us all coming back for more.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exciting piece of research. Until then, keep those brains buzzing.
Keep exploring.
And we'll catch you on the flip side.
See you then.